In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe. His armies stretched from the sun-scorched fields of Spain to the ancient heartlands of Austria and Prussia. Kings and emperors bowed to his will. Only one great power defied him: the vast, mysterious Russian Empire. Napoleon had once called Tsar Alexander I his friend. They had met on a raft in the middle of a river, smiling and promising peace. But behind the handshakes, tensions were simmering. The Tsar refused to enforce Napoleon's continental system, a grand economic blockade designed to cripple Britain. For Napoleon, this was an insult he could not ignore. If Russia would not bend, he would break it. So in June of 1812, he assembled the largest European army ever seen. Over 600,000 men, French, Polish, German, Italian, formed the Grande Armée. Their destination, Moscow. Napoleon was certain it would be a swift campaign. He envisioned a few decisive battles, a quick surrender from the Tsar, and a triumphant return to Paris. But Russia had other plans. As the Grande Armée marched east, they found nothing. The Russian army retreated, but not in chaos. They executed a scorched earth policy, burning villages, destroying crops, and poisoning wells. The invaders marched through a desolate, empty wasteland. Napoleon's grand army, built for speed and decisive battle, was now starving, its supply lines stretched to a breaking point. What was meant to be a quick war was turning into a logistical nightmare. Napoleon, relentless, pushed deeper into the endless Russian plains. His men, weakened by hunger and disease, pressed on, desperate for a final battle. Near the village of Borodino, the Russians finally made their stand. The battle that followed was one of the single bloodiest days of the 19th century. Tens of thousands fell on both sides, the ground soaked in blood, the air choked with cannon smoke. Technically, Napoleon won. The Russians retreated. But it was a hollow victory. His army was shattered, its spirit shaken. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow, he expected to be met by a delegation of city elders offering him the keys. Instead, he found an eerie, silent ghost town. Then the fire started. Set by the Russians themselves, the flames consumed the city, devouring the very shelter and supplies his army desperately needed. Stranded in the smoldering ruins, with a brutal winter approaching, Napoleon waited for a message from the Tsar. It never came. Finally, in October, he was forced to admit defeat. The order was given: retreat. What followed was a descent into hell. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Horses, vital for pulling cannons and supply wagons, collapsed and were immediately butchered for food. The Russian army and partisan fighters harried them at every turn, emerging from the forests for swift, brutal attacks before melting back into the snow. The retreat became a desperate, stumbling march for survival. The crossing of the Berezina River was the final, horrific chapter. With Russian cannons firing on them, thousands drowned in the icy waters or were crushed in the panicked stampede to cross makeshift bridges. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia with such confidence, only about 40,000 staggered back across the border. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was gone, frozen and buried in the Russian snow. He raced back to Paris, a broken emperor, trying desperately to raise new armies, but the world had sensed his weakness. Coalitions formed against him, and rebellions flared up across his empire. Within 2 years, he was defeated and exiled. His brief return in 1815 ended for good at Waterloo. The Russian campaign was more than a military defeat. It was the beginning of the end. Napoleon, the brilliant strategist, had made a fatal error. He overestimated his own genius and underestimated the forces of nature, the vastness of the land, and the unbreakable will of the Russian people. His greatest campaign became his greatest mistake, a timeless and cautionary tale about the deadly cost of hubris. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, And hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. See you next time.